Alright, so just the other day, I got around to watching the new Super Mario Bros. Movie. The 2023 one. Not the one from, like, the older one. I'm not going to pretend to know what year, but, like, the older one that everybody said was, like, one of the worst movies of all time. I'm only making this distinguishment right now because I've tried looking up a poster for the movie to stare at to kind of jog my memory as I kind of rant about this podcast. I'm using DuckDuckGo image search instead of Google image search, and DuckDuckGo is like a crystal ball in that it doesn't show you what you want to see. It will only show you what it thinks you need to see at the moment, and right now all it's showing me is the older version of the movie. As a quick overall summary, I'd say that this movie was like the best of both worlds in terms of one side being they actually had some clever and unique creative interpretations of like how to include like what we noticed from the game into lore to be canonized in the movie. And on the other end of the spectrum you have, man, it feels kind of lame how they just bashed a bunch of ideas together from the game to get fans to recognize it and be like, oh, I remember that, I remember seeing that. It's pretty much what that Meat Canyon animation was about. It kind of flip-flops between the two very chaotically. A good example I can think of this would be to just pay attention to the pacing of the movie. There were a lot of moments in the movie where it felt like even when they wanted to like stop and hang on a joke to be like, remember this from the games, a lot of the times it felt like those scenes went by way faster than you had time to really register them. As well as also having tons of scenes where you'd have to like pause the movie once you like had it on DVD later and be like, oh, this is a cool detail I noticed. The pacing is so quickened, in fact, that there are a lot of points where characters' personalities will seem really disjointed. I don't mind that they took the direction with Peach's character that they did. Luigi being the new damsel in distress was a good change of angle. Peach actually shows off at multiple points in the movie that she can be badass without afterwards turning right to the camera and trying to preach about how girls are empowered or some shit. Which is probably ammo that a bunch of sweaty nerds were just waiting to drop right into their lap. But a lot of the places where it falls through is that things will just come out of her mouth that don't quite line up with what other characters say to her. One example I can think of from the movie being that she tells the main toad that starts following Mario to evacuate the city. And then he just kind of says, no, I promised I wouldn't let anything happen to you. I promised I wouldn't let you get hurt. And then she just kind of gives this nod of approval, be like, oh yeah, I guess you're cool. You can come with us for the rest of the adventure. In normal conversation, you would think somebody would, once, staging initial protest, being like, why are you still sticking around? Go. Another example of the rushed pacing might be the interactions between Mario and Donkey Kong. At first, they have a very initial rivalry of like, oh, they have to battle each other, and then Mario ends up defeating Donkey Kong. Spoiler alert, by the way. Mario defeats Donkey Kong, and for the rest of the movie, they have like this mini feud, and there seem to be points that they keep bringing up that like Donkey Kong is like ashamed of himself because his father doesn't approve of him as much, or at least that feels like the trope they're trying to go for. But I feel like it's not as like heavy as you would normally expect out of this kind of subplot. Most of it is only from Donkey Kong's perspective, where he's like, oh, my father's embarrassed of me. And we see Cranky Kong being like, oh, son, stop being ridiculous. But we don't see him like outright chastising his son. So it ends up being resolved very quickly. It's not necessarily a flaw. It's just that it feels like one angle they tried squeezing into the movie. They only got about half of it in there. Maybe some of the disjointed nature of this movie stems from, during production, I heard that Nintendo initially gave the movie to Illumination to start animating, which they do have their logo in the beginning credits, but I also heard that eventually they took it away from Illumination because they didn't like what Illumination was doing, and then they ended up handing off the rest of it to Universal. So I'm wondering if they had Illumination do most of the animating of the scenes for the movie, and then they had Universal recut it. I don't know. There was like one scene I remember that was kind of weird. It was a transitional scene where Mario and Toad are running on a 2D plane after getting off of one of those elevators, And for just like a few frames or just a few seconds, you see them running on a 2D plane and you think maybe they're going to do another scene, but then it just cuts to them running in 3D again. It didn't even fix the disjointed nature of the movie when I tried like watching back on some scenes and like trying to imagine in my head like if the characters were speaking Japanese, you know, both like the vocal language and like the dialogue might be slightly more elaborate in translation than English would normally be. Could you squeeze in like dialogue that sounds more fluid or more common or at least made more sense in Japanese? That trick didn't even work in my head, so I didn't even know what I was talking about then, I guess. There are a lot of very intense moments in this movie, and by that I mean violence. People will just deck each other in the face, send them smashing into walls 50 feet away as if it were Dragon Ball Z. This is a weird angle for a kid's movie. I keep expecting to see these characters get punched into walls and then like start bleeding. Mario's face even starts to get like bruised, or he ends up getting a black eye while fighting Bowser in the final scene of the movie when they get back to Brooklyn. Spoilers alert. There are repeated moments in the movie where like metal will end up heating up, red hot, molting. Every time Luigi is there, like next to the red hot metal, and he just doesn't feel the effects of being burnt. My thoughts on Chris Pratt and Charlie Day being the voice actors of Mario and Luigi, as well as Jack Black being the voice of Bowser. I feel like this also lends to the same problem as I stated in the overall descriptor of this, where you kind of got a flip-flop between the two worlds of what people expected. There were moments where I kept wanting to tell myself, like, all right, I guess the voice kind of fits, but, like, it just wasn't meshing sometimes for me. There were other points where I was able to just, like, kind of go along with the voice. I'm guessing what they were trying to do with picking these characters was find an in-between between the Captain Lou voice of, like, the, hey, Luigi, that, like, Vinesauce likes to do, as well as the guy who does the voice clips for Super Mario 64, like, Yahoo! Picking those actors to be the voice actors would definitely seem like a good in-between voice in terms of pitch, in theory, but at the same time, it is also super easy to imagine that they just picked some big-name American actors to try and get people more interested in the movie out of association or familiarity with these actors, when most of the time these two actors were known for their live-action performances and not necessarily their iconic voices. Bowser's voice actor being Jack Black. I like Jack Black. He's a big goofball. He has an interesting career, a surprisingly lighthearted career given Tenacious D, but whatever. His voice does not mesh as well. I can still tell it's very much that it's just Jack Black at some points, even if he tries to like put on a more raspy and intimidating angle to it. Another weird scene I remember from the movie is like when Mario and Toad first walk into like the Mushroom Kingdom. You see like this row of like 3 coin blocks and these other toads that are punching the coin blocks. There's like a split second in the scene where like they look exhausted. And it's just making me think like, is this just what normal work is supposed to be in the Mushroom Kingdom? Even from the poster I'm looking at right now, there's a store that's clearly labeled antiques. So there has to be other occupations for like trading and bartering or stuff. They tried to portray with like the exhaustion of toads that you can just get gold coins or other money out of punching these blocks, and after some amount of time arbitrarily jumping all day, they get exhausted. Are they supposed to be like the equivalent of construction workers? Is this supposed to be like the bank? I don't know. Those are like the only like weird or slightly negative points I'd have about the movie. The positives of the movie, I'd say, are I liked the scenes where they would cut to like a semi-2D running plane of the characters. You got to kind of see them platform around a bit. The scene in Brooklyn where they're running to their first plumbing gig. I would have liked to see a scene where Cranky Kong goes to the overworld or the real world or Brooklyn or whatever, and he ends up meeting up with Jumpman. And they end up getting into a feud because most of the original Donkey Kong games that you played with Mario, the Donkey Kong in that game was technically Cranky Kong, and the Donkey Kong Country games are a different Donkey Kong. The Donkey Kong in that Donkey Kong, it's weird, but apparently that's canon, Donkey Kong. I don't know. I watched a few game theory videos back in the day. This is how I know this. Donkey Kong. I could be completely wrong. Donkey Kong. I liked the jungle scene where Mario first starts following Toad through like the giant mushroom stalks, and you get to see like all the jungle enemies. They try to interpret them as actual creatures that live out in the wild. Like they have an ecosystem. It's interesting to me just because I'm a fan of like the creative approach to portraying creatures as like having behavior that you'd be able to observe in a laid out documentary. Another thing that was interesting for them to canonize, along with Jumpman being a separate person from Mario, is the idea that the Kongs are the people who build cars. That is very interesting to think about. The Toads just kind of futz around with trading and bartering, it seems, and like also jumping exhaustedly to punch coin blocks for a banking system, I guess. I don't know. But the Kongs are straight up like master mechanics and like kind of geniuses. I got a lot of Lord of the Rings vibes, and I guess maybe a bit of not Alice in Wonderland. What's the other one? What's the simpler one? I don't know if simpler is the word for it. Fuck, I can't remember. I was also getting a lot of the Wizard of Oz vibes, just when I saw the Koopas flying with spears and shit. One thing that was a bit confusing to me was the giant eel. No, wait. I just realized while saying that, the giant eel. At first I thought it was just like this big Leviathan shark, but now that I say out loud that it was a giant eel, because I remember Donkey Kong being like, oh, I'm going to be digested to death in a giant eel. I'm just remembering Omori. Not Omori. Fuck, I forget his name. Umari? The eel? From Super Mario 64? I think that's all I have to say about this movie. Congratulations, you just listened to a random review that probably sounds about half as similar to other reviews you've probably heard in the past, except this one was a few months later than when the movie actually came out, and I'm also not a popular movie reviewer.